We begin a series that's going to go out throughout the month. Both Tom and I are going to be working with it on the Sermon on the Mount, the centerpiece of the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and part of 7. In this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reveals the essence of who he is. He gets us a glimpse, even more than the things he's been doing or talking about so far, of who his Father is. It's not a lesson in morality, and it's not a book of rules by any means. It's not a glimpse into heaven either, as some people have tried to make it out to be, something which is impossible on earth but possible only in heaven. Jesus spoke of it in the present time. It's a talk about being like Jesus, being like God's intentions for all of humanity. You may correctly and quickly discern as we discuss it, and as you read it again perhaps, you may discern that while these are very, very important words of Jesus, they are also among the most ignored words of Jesus. So for the next 4 weeks, we'll be talking some more about the Sermon on the Mount. Now, first, context and perspective. The writer of Matthew is telling us a story. It's a gospel story, a story of the good news of Jesus Christ. He's not reporting. Just as when we tell a story about anything, Matthew is first establishing a mood, a setting. He is writing his story specifically for reading to groups of people, disciples, who have gathered almost 50 years after Jesus spoke the words which are being referred to. So when Jesus is talking about disciple in the book of Matthew, Matthew's not confining that word to the group of 12 men that we're familiar with. Matthew is speaking of the disciples as people who have heard about Jesus and are gathering now to hear more. So the many disciples here include all those who have been following Jesus within the story, but also it now includes those persons who have heard the story later from apostles and others, who are gathering together in some kind of setting to hear and learn more about Jesus. People kind of like us around the world today who have heard about Jesus and in an effort to know him better are gathering to hear more. So, welcome to the same mountain. The mountain. And here's an example of what Matthew is doing in both telling the story and constructing a theological way for the people hearing the story to think about Jesus. Matthew was the go-to guy, as gospel writers go, for his Jewish brothers and sisters. They were his mission field. So he puts Jesus up on a mountain, just like Moses, who his audience already knew very, very well, went up on a mountain, Mount Sinai, for 40 days and received the 10 Commandments. The gospel writer Luke, on the other hand, who also told a version of these Beatitudes, put the setting on a plain, on a low spot. He wanted people to know Jesus as one of them, a man who is extraordinary not only because he was the Son of God, but because he listened to and followed his Father. Luke was writing mainly to Greeks who extolled the virtue of being fully human above all else, of taking care of mind and body through discipline, intellectual pursuits, and physical challenges. Luke wanted his listeners to know about the extraordinary man who his listeners could emulate and follow. Matthew wanted his first listeners to know Jesus as the great liberator, a savior like Moses. and worthy of the regard already being given to Moses. Same story, same gospel. Two different writers speaking to two different groups of people. So Jesus is on the mountain in Matthew. But then he does something that culturally doesn't fit with our notions of how a great speaker or teacher should act. He doesn't do a sound check. He doesn't check the lights. He doesn't pose. He doesn't walk the stage in a choreographed manner or intentionally draw any kind of extra attention to himself at all. Instead, he sits down. Now, this was not uncommon for great Jewish teachers of the time, nor is it uncommon for the great Eastern teachers of today. Think of the Dalai Lama or the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, intellectual and spiritual giants who, when they have something very important to teach, also sit down. That simple act of Jesus reminds us that Judaism in the Middle East of the first century was still very much an Eastern religion, but one which had begun to be affected by the Greek Western influences which had been brought to them several centuries earlier when Israel was conquered by Alexander the Great. You know, all of history, all of life, from the mundane to the magnificent, all of history is tied together in some very intricate way. I'm standing here behind a pulpit in a place that is patterned after a medieval courtroom, not because that's the way Jesus did it, but because Alexander the Great brought the culture of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle to Palestine and then to Europe in the Roman Empire, what later became the Roman Empire. I'm acting Greek while trying to relate the messages of a Jewish reformer, and so are you. You're listening to Middle Eastern messages while sitting down there on hard, semi-comfortable benches, just as Westerner Greeks did in Athens. Jesus sat down, which meant that everyone listening would immediately have sat down too, and would have begun to kind of scrunch in, lean in, move a little bit closer in order to hear what Jesus was going to say. And so now, the crowd scrunching over, sitting still with their ears focused, and they hear Jesus begin this way: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, we hear that with jaded ears because we've heard it so many times before. A comfortable rhythm is being established. And while there's nothing wrong with rhythms and harmonies on the radio or in the universe from God, sometimes we hum along with the music while the words become secondary, even extraneous. But those words heard by the first disciples and by the disciples listening to the Gospel of Matthew, those words, blessed, those first words of this magnificent speech, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Those words would not have lulled anyone at that time into spiritual relaxation. In fact, they would have responded almost certainly with a loud and collective, "Say what?" In this sermon, in his teaching, Jesus is going to reveal who he is in more powerful ways than anything he has said or done so far. He sat down and then proceeded to turn the world upside down. Or another way of looking at it, he was turning an already upside down world right side up again. He was turning on the lights in a world become dark. He'd begun tearing at imprisoning doctrinal metal with the jaws of life. Blessed, and that's not the only way to translate that. It's a big word. Blessed, happy, fortunate, lucky are the poor in spirit. Now, when I hear something that shakes my formerly ingrained ways of seeing the world, I'll find that sometimes inadvertently, without thinking about it, my jaw will drop a little bit and I'll kind of look up in the air at nothing in particular. But it's an act of soaking in whatever has just affected me in a big way. I know each of you have those same kinds of moments too, and we all react just a little bit differently. But I can easily imagine that crowd that day collectively gasping a little, becoming perfectly still, and letting lines of heretofore unknown dominoes begin to fall together in their minds. In a very hierarchical society, as Israel was at the time, where the priests lorded it over the riffraff, where the Pharisees lorded it over the priests, where Rome lorded it over the Pharisees, and the Caesar lorded it over all of the known world. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That would have felt like summer rain on a parched earth. Blessed, happy, fortunate, lucky are the poor in spirit. Would have been like being on the inside at the camps of Dachau or Auschwitz and seeing the American and English troops coming toward the camp. The people who had been following Jesus were those who had almost lost any semblance of hope about the future. These were the poor people of Palestine, those who couldn't get into the temple because they didn't have the money even for a sacrificial dove. These were people, some of whom had the dirt of their child's grave under their fingernails. They said their Shabbat prayers faithfully every week, but did God even hear them? The Roman soldiers were always watching them, the Pharisees ignored them, and the stink from Golgotha wafted over them in their part of town on the other side of the tracks with great frequency. Poor in spirit. Two sisters sat in my office last Wednesday. One had been clean of her meth habit for 62, and she said 1.5 days. She has 4 kids at home, a long-gone husband, and the rent is due and the eviction notice is on her door. Her sister cleans houses, has 3 kids, no extra room, and no food in the house. 2 churches, not far. Wouldn't even open their locked doors to them, even as the one sister was trying to keep her newly clean sister aware of the promise that God is love and God will take care of you. Poor in spirit, seeing the army issue car in front of the house and 2 young soldiers get out and start the walk to the front door. Poor in spirit, age 54, 500 job applications and 3 interviews in the past 2 years. Poor in spirit, getting kicked out of a church because you dare to love a daughter who is gay. Poor in spirit, school becomes a daily horror show as the other kids pile on. You're too fat, you're too skinny, your mom's on crack, and it's Friday and the only food at home is the apple in your pocket, which is saved from lunch. Sorry, we have no money for rent, no food in our food bank, no time to listen to your whining, so go away from our front door. The preacher's busy on his sermon. That's not even to mention Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon, a mall in Nairobi, Kenya, tent cities in the Sudan and Haiti, cardboard-populated dumps in Juarez, radioactive tides moving across the Pacific from Japan, or countless church congregations who will leave church this morning filled with self-righteous anger born of fear. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Some of us don't even like to hear those words, really hear them without merely humming along to them. It's so much easier and more comfortable to judge, categorize, ostracize, and belittle. Just like the Pharisees, just like the Roman soldiers. But then there's that phone call in the middle of the night, or the doctor who says stage 4, or the pink slip, or that envelope lying on the table in a too-empty home. And anyone who lives with the veneer kind of faith built on the right words, holy jewelry, and an inherited faith can find their own spindly spiritual legs kicked out from underneath them as the rest of the world seems to march blindly past them. This is the kingdom of God. Theirs is the kingdom of God, he said. God has already accepted us. Is that what he really said? We don't have to wait for pie in the sky, for the sweet by and by? Is that, am I hearing that right? But therein is the power in the world of being turned upright. Here's the great, glad, good news that can make a person dance for joy if they're listening with ears to hear, hearing what Jesus just said. He said, God is with you even as I am here with you, sitting with you right now. Lean in now. Do you hear me? You don't have to wait. You are already beloved. There's nothing you have to do to be more loved. Now I'm putting some words in Jesus' mouth, but feel like an absolute schmuck? God adores you. Feel forgotten, hopeless, with no idea where next month's rent is coming from? Abba has your name tattooed on the palm of his hand. I think that's from Isaiah 12. The two sisters left with a couple boxes of food, which is put together by the tweens, and some toiletries and some gas money. And I'm getting together a few more dollars for them. But it turns out that more than anything, that what they really wanted, needed, ached for, was some assurance that God is with them, that they are not alone, that locked doors are not the norm in the kingdom of heaven, that they are worthy to sit with God. Now, Marissa welcomed them when they came in the building. And then I took over. But that's only possible because we were here. And we were here because you are here. That's back to those connections. We're all connected to each other because of our tithes, our gifts, and our offerings, and because we maintain a building and outward and visible signs of welcome. There's things going around here during the day. The place looks alive, inviting. But most of all, because all of us, are connected through time, through eternity. Through the table that we gather around today, we are connected to the one who walked up a mountain and then sat down and made the world new, always new, again. As we continue now into a time of communion on page 17, let me preface communion with something else. It has something to do with American history, but also has a great deal to do with World Communion Day, which this day is. The Reverend Ella MacDonald, who spoke here last week, and I know everybody seemed to really enjoy that. She's from the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is found all around the country. The history of the AME Church, however, is fascinating. In 1760, a man named Richard Allen was born. He was born a slave in Delaware. And as he grew a little bit older, he began doing odd jobs outside of his service to his master, for which he'd make some money. Chopping wood, helping with baled hay, different jobs like that. And by the time he was 21, he'd saved almost $2,000, which he used to buy his freedom from his master. What he did with that freedom was begin to preach out of some of the Methodist churches which had begun to be established by 1781 in the northern colonies. And he spoke in New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and became a regular member at the St. George St. George Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, the very first Methodist church in the United States, first established building, the first established Methodist church in the country. He had preached there sometimes, and more freedmen, more and more African Americans began to come to that church. And at first they just kind of sat where they wanted to, but then there became a lot of them. And some of the elders in the church, the non-African American elders, asked them to stand around the walls of the building, and then said there was too many of them, so they had to move to the gallery. And Richard Allen, one Sunday, along with some of the other African American members of the church, decided to come down out of that gallery when communion was opened up and people were coming to the altar to receive communion. They came down and they knelt. But before they were served communion, some of the non-African American elders came up behind them and lifted them up away from the altar and said, "No, not here." Imagine Richard Allen and his brothers and sisters got up and walked down that aisle and out the door. They were urged to join the Protestant Episcopal Church. But Richard Allen admired the Methodist Church, the simplicity of methods. He admired Wesley's anti-slavery stance, which had affected all of England and slave trade in England already. He wanted to stay within the theologies and the traditions as they had been established of the Methodist Church. So he began the African Methodist Episcopal Church with some of his fellows. And it was primarily in the New England area until after the Civil War. Then it began to spread south and west, and now the AME Church is all over the place. It's never been a wealthy church by any means. And I can tell you assuredly that there are weeks when Ella doesn't get paid. She did mention to me offhand, though, that one of the things that the church could use was a new computer. And they've got an old, I think it's like an old 486 that they do for bookkeeping and things, something ancient, but it's adequate. But I was trying to send something to her, and I found that out inadvertently, that they don't have a computer in the church. So I thought, and I asked around this morning, and other people agreed that it might be a good idea, that the offerings that we leave today at the communion rail, which we often do as we take communion, will be going towards a new computer and maybe a year's worth of Wi-Fi connections. And we already have a volunteer to help set it up. So if you'd be so moved to do that, I think we'd be part of a holy tradition that began when a great teacher sat down on a mountain and continued when another great teacher walked out the door affirming what Methodism really was, and continuing through to this day when you hear great preaching like Ella brought to us last week.